Hey there! Tonight we begin with a journey into the surprising reality that medieval kingship, far from being the ultimate prize of power and luxury that modern imagination suggests, was actually a position that many intelligent and informed people actively sought to avoid, where the throne represented not just opportunity but deadly danger, crushing responsibility and constant misery that made it genuinely rational to prefer positions with less apparent prestige but vastly better prospects for long life, personal freedom, and actual happiness. From the shocking statistics showing that medieval kings died violently at rates that would terrify modern heads of state, to the impossible political pressures that left monarchs perpetually balancing between rival factions ready to murder them at the first sign of weakness, from the financial nightmares where kingdoms were perpetually bankrupt despite kings' supposed wealth, to the complete lack of personal freedom where every moment was public performance, and every decision could trigger rebellions. From the genuine cases of men who refused crowns or who abdicated in relief, to the propaganda machines that had to work overtime to make kingship seem desirable enough that the system could continue. The story of medieval monarchy reveals that the men wearing crowns were often prisoners of their positions, living shorter and more stressful lives than many of their subjects, trapped in roles that combined maximum responsibility with maximum danger and minimum personal satisfaction. So before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if genuinely enjoying what's shared here. And let those comments know where the listening is happening from and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When thinking about medieval kingship, the modern imagination immediately conjures images shaped by fantasy literature and historical romance. Powerful monarchs ruling from magnificent castles, unlimited wealth at their disposal, armies obeying their commands, subjects bowing in reverence, lives of luxury and privilege that represent the pinnacle of human achievement and desire. These romantic images draw from selective historical memory and from deliberate medieval propaganda that work to make kingship seem glorious and desirable. Yet the reality that medieval people actually experienced was profoundly different, with kingship being a position of extraordinary danger, crushing stress, impossible expectations and genuine misery that made intelligent observers understand that the crown was more curse than blessing. The reality was that medieval kings died violently at rates that would shock modern observers. The assassination, the death in battle, the murder by relatives, the execution after deposition, all these occurred with frequency that made kingship one of the most dangerous occupations in medieval society. The life expectancy for kings was actually lower than for many other social positions, with the combination of political violence, stress-related illness, and the various hazards of rulership creating mortality rates that made the throne genuinely life-threatening. The men who understood these statistics, and who had opportunity to observe kings' actual lives, often concluded that power wasn't worth the price. Picture this: England in 1216. King John dies, probably from dysentery though some suspected poison, after years of military failures, political defeats, and baronial rebellion that made his reign miserable despite his royal power. His 9-year-old son becomes Henry III, inheriting a kingdom in civil war, massive debts, hostile nobility, and impossible expectations. The boy king's guardians understand that the crown they're placing on this child's head is more likely burden than blessing, that the position they're giving him will dominate and constrain his entire life, and that his chances of dying peacefully in old age are substantially lower than if he'd been born to a different family. Yet the succession must proceed because the alternative, disputed succession, and further civil war, would be even worse. The child accepts the crown not because it's desirable, but because refusing would be unthinkable, and because at age 9 he can't fully comprehend what he's accepting. Tonight's journey explores the multiple dimensions of why medieval kingship was genuinely undesirable position that intelligent people had good reasons to avoid, the staggering rates of violent death that made the throne literally deadly, the impossible political pressures that left kings perpetually vulnerable to rebellion and assassination, the financial nightmares that left monarchs personally stressed despite theoretical control of kingdoms' resources, the complete lack of privacy and personal freedom that made kings prisoners of their positions, the religious terrors about divine judgment that tormented conscientious monarchs, the family betrayals and succession crises that poisoned personal relationships, the military obligations that required personal combat leadership, the crushing judicial and administrative burdens, the health impacts of chronic stress and poison fears, the comparative analysis showing that other positions often offered better lives, the documented cases of crown refusals and abdications, and the massive propaganda efforts required to maintain fiction that kingship was desirable. From the mortality statistics to the psychological realities, the story reveals why the medieval throne was a position that many intelligent people rightly feared and actively sought to avoid when possible. The raw statistics on how medieval kings died reveal that wearing a crown was genuinely one of the most dangerous positions in medieval society, with rates of violent death that would be considered completely unacceptable for any modern leadership position. Understanding these mortality patterns demonstrates that the danger wasn't theoretical, but was immediate, constant, and statistically likely to result in violent death. The assassination rates for medieval monarchs were extraordinarily high compared to any modern political position. The calculation of English kings alone shows shocking patterns. From 1066 to 1485, a period of about 420 years covering roughly 20 monarchs, approximately 8 died violently, murdered, killed in battle, or executed after deposition, giving a violent death rate of roughly 40%. The French monarchy showed similar patterns with multiple kings dying from assassination, poisoning, or violence. The Holy Roman Emperors, the various German princes, the Italian city-state rulers, and monarchs across medieval Europe all showed elevated violent death rates that made kingship statistically dangerous. The battlefield deaths that claimed numerous medieval monarchs reflected the expectation that kings would personally lead armies into combat. Richard I of England died from an infected crossbow wound received while besieging a castle. Harold II of England died at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. James IV of Scotland died at Flodden in 1513. Richard III of England died at Bosworth Field in 1485. The medieval expectation that kings would fight alongside their troops meant that monarchs faced the same combat risks as soldiers, with the additional risk that they were priority targets whom enemies specifically sought to kill. The battlefield mortality for kings was substantially higher than for soldiers generally, as monarchs were deliberately targeted, and as their deaths could end wars. The murder by relatives created a particularly grim category of royal deaths. The succession disputes, the ambitions of brothers or sons, and the family betrayals produced numerous cases where kings were killed by their own relatives. William II of England, William Rufus, was killed by an arrow while hunting in circumstances suggesting assassination, possibly by relatives. Edward II of England was deposed by his wife and her lover, then murdered in captivity. The fratricide, patricide, and various other forms of royal family murder that occurred across medieval Europe demonstrated that kings couldn't trust even close relatives who might see the crown as worth killing for. The deposition, followed by execution, created another common end for medieval monarchs. The kings who lost political struggles didn't simply retire, but were often killed to prevent future challenges. Edward V and his brother, the princes in the Tower, were likely murdered after being deposed. Richard II was deposed and died in captivity under suspicious circumstances. The pattern across Europe showed that deposed kings were rarely allowed to live peacefully, as their continued existence created focal point for opposition to the new regime. The knowledge that political failure meant likely death created extraordinary pressure on reigning monarchs. The poisoning fears that tormented medieval monarchs reflected genuine risk that enemies might use poison to assassinate them. The food tasters employed by cautious kings, the elaborate precautions around food preparation, and the restrictions on who could approach monarchs all reflected real fears about poisoning. While actual poisoning deaths were probably less common than fears suggested, medieval poison knowledge was limited, and many suspected poisonings were probably natural deaths. The constant fear affected quality of life, and the genuine possibility created additional stress beyond the actual poisoning deaths that did occur. The stress-related illness that killed many medieval monarchs probably doesn't appear in violent death statistics, but reflected the health impact of constant political pressure. The heart attacks, strokes, and various other stress-related conditions that killed kings in their 40s or 50s occurred at rates suggesting that the chronic stress of kingship significantly shortened lifespans even for those who avoided violence. The comparison of royal lifespans to wealthy non-royal aristocrats shows that kings often died younger, despite having access to better nutrition and medical care, suggesting that the stress and danger of kingship outweighed material advantages. The comparative mortality rates between medieval kings and other social positions reveal that kingship was extraordinarily dangerous compared to alternatives. The bishops and abbots who held significant power and wealth but who weren't kings lived substantially longer on average. The wealthy merchants who had material comfort without political power died peacefully of old age at higher rates than monarchs. The aristocrats who held significant lands but who weren't competing for crowns showed better survival statistics. The mortality comparison demonstrates that the very apex of the social hierarchy was actually more dangerous than positions slightly below it, creating a perverse situation where advancement to highest rank decreased life expectancy. The age-specific mortality patterns showed that kings faced elevated risks throughout their reigns, not just during initial vulnerable periods. The newly crowned king faced danger from disappointed claimants and from those who opposed the succession. The established king faced danger from ambitious relatives and from nobles tired of their rule. The elderly king faced danger from impatient heirs and from those who viewed weakness as opportunity. The elevated risk at all ages meant that there was never a safe period where kings could relax their vigilance. The succession crisis deaths that occurred when succession was disputed often killed multiple claimants and created particularly bloody periods. The anarchy in England, 1135 to 1153, where Stephen and Matilda fought for the crown, created extended civil war that killed many beyond just the principals. The Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1485, killed multiple kings and claimants through decades of conflict. The succession disputes meant that the mortality risks extended beyond sitting monarchs to include anyone with plausible claim to throne, making royal blood itself dangerous. The international patterns showing elevated royal mortality across all medieval European kingdoms demonstrate that this wasn't peculiarity of English history, but was general pattern reflecting inherent dangers of kingship. The Holy Roman Emperors, French kings, Castilian monarchs, Aragonese rulers, Portuguese kings, Scandinavian monarchs, Polish kings, Hungarian rulers, all showed elevated violent death rates. The consistency across different kingdoms with different political structures and different cultural contexts suggests that royal mortality resulted from inherent features of medieval kingship rather than from local circumstances. The temporal patterns showing that royal mortality remained high throughout the medieval period, despite changes in other areas, indicate that this wasn't merely early medieval phenomenon that improved over time. The late medieval kings faced similar mortality risks as early medieval monarchs, suggesting that the underlying structural features creating danger persisted despite broader social development. The continuation of high royal mortality into early modern periods shows that these patterns only gradually improved, rather than suddenly resolving at some clear historical transition point. The cause of death categorization, distinguishing assassination, battlefield death, execution after deposition, suspicious deaths in custody, and death from illness, probably related to political stress, shows that royal mortality was overwhelmingly political, rather than resulting from random misfortune. The kings didn't die from accidents or from diseases unrelated to their positions, but rather died specifically because they were kings. The political nature of royal mortality meant that the position itself created the danger, rather than kings merely being unlucky individuals. Understanding royal mortality statistics demonstrates conclusively that medieval kingship was genuinely dangerous occupation, with violent death rates that would be completely unacceptable in any modern context. The roughly 40% violent death rate for medieval kings means that accepting the crown meant accepting substantial probability of being murdered, killed in battle, or executed. The rational person evaluating these odds might well conclude that the power and prestige of kingship weren't worth the mortality risk, making refusal of crown or avoidance of succession rational choice rather than sign of cowardice or lack of ambition. The mortality statistics alone provide powerful evidence that medieval kingship was genuinely undesirable position, that intelligent people had good reason to fear. The political position of medieval kings was far more constrained and vulnerable than modern imagination suggests, with monarchs facing constant pressure from multiple competing factions, possessing limited actual power to impose their will, and living under constant threat of rebellion if they failed to maintain impossible balance between competing interests. Understanding these political realities reveals why kingship was a position of constant stress and vulnerability rather than of comfortable dominance. The noble power that medieval kings had to contend with was substantial and genuine rather than merely ceremonial. The great aristocrats controlled their own territories, commanded their own military forces, possessed their own judicial authority, and had independent economic bases that made them genuinely powerful actors, rather than merely subordinate officials. The king who offended powerful nobles faced real possibility of rebellion backed by significant military force. The history of medieval kingdoms is filled with rebellions by powerful nobles. The Magna Carta rebellion against King John, the Barons' Wars during Henry III's reign, the revolts against Richard II, and countless other examples across Europe demonstrate that kings couldn't simply command obedience, but had to maintain political support through constant negotiation and compromise. The collective noble power that could be mobilized against a king often exceeded the king's own direct military strength. The king's own lands and resources were typically substantial, but weren't necessarily larger than the combined wealth and military power of his major nobles. The successful rebellion required coordinating multiple nobles, which was difficult but certainly possible when nobles were sufficiently alienated. The king's position depended on maintaining noble divisions, and on ensuring that any given rebellion involved only minority of nobles, rather than united opposition. The political balancing required to prevent united noble opposition, while accomplishing any royal agenda created constant stress. The church as political actor with its own interests, its own resources, and its own claim to authority, separate from and potentially superior to royal authority, created additional constraint on royal power. The medieval church owned substantial lands, controlled significant wealth, commanded loyalty from clergy across the kingdom, and could claim divine sanction for its positions. The king who came into conflict with church faced possible excommunication, interdict on the kingdom, ecclesiastical support for rebellions, and the propaganda disadvantage of being cast as enemy of God. The famous conflicts like Henry II and Thomas Becket, Henry IV at Canossa, and various other church-state struggles demonstrated that kings couldn't simply dominate the church, but had to negotiate carefully with ecclesiastical authority. The urban power centres, particularly in more commercialised regions like Italy, Flanders, and parts of Germany, represented additional political forces that constrained royal authority. The wealthy merchant cities possessed economic resources that kings needed, military forces to defend their autonomy, and the capability to support rivals if alienated. The king who tried to tax cities excessively, or to interfere too aggressively in urban affairs, faced resistance ranging from passive non-compliance to active rebellion. The need to maintain urban support while also satisfying noble and ecclesiastical interests created complex political balancing acts. The foreign powers who might support internal opponents if doing so served their interests added international dimension to domestic political vulnerability. The king, facing internal opposition, might find enemies providing money, military support, or safe haven to rebels. The French support for Scottish independence movements, the English support for Burgundian separatism, and various other examples of foreign interference in domestic politics meant that kings couldn't focus solely on domestic opponents, but had to consider international implications of domestic political conflicts. The possibility that foreign powers would exploit any weakness meant that kings had to project strength even when their actual position was vulnerable. The succession uncertainties and disputed claims created factions supporting different potential heirs, even while current king lived. The nobles, clergy, and urban leaders positioning themselves for succession struggles might undermine current king, to curry favour with likely successor. The king whose health was failing, or who was producing no heir faced particular vulnerability, as political actors shifted allegiance toward likely future rulers. The succession politics meant that kings faced opposition, not just from those dissatisfied with current policies, but also from those betting on future changes. The administrative limitations on actual royal power meant that kings' formal authority often exceeded their practical capability to enforce decisions, the limited bureaucracy, the dependence on local officials who might be more loyal to local nobles than to distant king, and the simple difficulties of communication and transportation in medieval world all meant that royal commands didn't automatically translate into reality. The king might issue orders that local officials simply ignored or that nobles prevented from being implemented. The gap between formal authority and practical power created constant frustration. The financial dependence on tax revenues that required consent from representative bodies meant that kings couldn't simply fund their policies, but had to negotiate with parliaments, estates general, or similar bodies. The need to request extraordinary taxation to fund wars or other major expenses gave these bodies leverage to demand concessions in exchange for grants. The English Parliament's development was substantially driven by kings' financial needs, creating opportunities for Parliament to extract concessions. The financial constraint meant that kings often couldn't afford policies they wanted to implement, limiting their effective power regardless of their theoretical authority. The military dependence on feudal levies or hired mercenaries rather than on standing armies, loyal specifically to the king, meant that military power was actually distributed rather than concentrated in royal hands. The king commanding army was actually coordinating forces raised and often commanded by nobles who might or might not fully obey royal strategy. The mercenaries who might serve king today might serve his enemies tomorrow if pay was better. The lack of reliable military force answering solely to royal command meant that king's military power was less absolute than often imagined. The information limitations, where kings often lacked accurate knowledge about what was actually happening in distant parts of their kingdoms, created vulnerability to being deceived or manipulated. The nobles controlling local information could present situations in ways that served their interests, rather than providing kings with accurate intelligence. The difficulty of verifying reports and of detecting deception meant that kings often made decisions based on incomplete or deliberately false information. The information asymmetry disadvantaged kings relative to local power holders with better local knowledge. The judicial limitations, where kings' courts competed with ecclesiastical courts, noble courts, and urban courts, meant that royal justice didn't monopolise legal authority. The disputes about which court had jurisdiction, the appeals to different judicial systems, and the parallel legal structures all limited kings' practical power to impose their legal preferences. The king might make law, but enforcement depended on cooperation from multiple judicial systems that weren't fully under royal control. The ideological limitations, where medieval political thought emphasised kings' obligations and limited authority rather than absolute power, meant that kings who seemed too tyrannical faced not just practical resistance, but ideological opposition claiming they were violating fundamental principles of proper kingship. The medieval political theory that legitimate authority required ruling justly, and that tyrannical kings forfeited legitimacy, provided ideological basis for resistance. The king who violated perceived norms faced opposition that could claim moral high ground. The exhausting nature of constantly maintaining political balance, of managing competing interests, of preventing coalitions against royal authority, and of addressing constant crises created psychological toll that wore down even capable monarchs. The king couldn't simply make decisions and see them implemented, but had to engage in constant negotiation, had to manage personalities and factions, had to balance competing legitimate interests, and had to do all this while knowing that failure could mean deposition or death. The stress of this political position was enormous and was genuinely unending throughout a king's reign. Understanding the political realities of medieval kingship reveals that kings were far more constrained and vulnerable than romantic images suggest. The position involved balancing multiple powerful actors who possessed genuine capability to resist or overthrow royal authority, operating with limited administrative and military capacity to enforce decisions, depending on cooperation from bodies that could withhold support, and doing all of this under threat of rebellion, deposition, or assassination if the political balance collapsed. The political dimension alone made kingship position of extraordinary stress and vulnerability that intelligent observers might rationally choose to avoid rather than to seek. The financial position of medieval kings combined theoretical control of vast resources with practical reality of chronic indebtedness, constant financial crises, and personal stress about money that made the economic dimension of kingship far more burden than privilege. Understanding royal finances reveals another dimension of why kingship was genuinely undesirable, despite appearance of wealth. The structural deficit that characterized most medieval kingdoms resulted from the gap between regular revenues and the expenses that kingship required. The peacetime royal revenues from domain lands, from customary dues, and from limited regular taxation often barely covered basic administrative costs and court expenses. Any extraordinary expense, war, diplomatic initiatives, castle building, dealing with natural disasters, required extraordinary revenues that weren't reliably available. The structural situation where expenses typically exceeded regular income meant that most kings spent most of their reign struggling with inadequate finances. The war costs that consumed enormous resources created the most severe financial pressures. The medieval warfare was extraordinarily expensive, paying soldiers, purchasing equipment, feeding armies, conducting sieges, ransoming captured nobles, and all the other costs of military operations could drain treasuries that took years to accumulate. The 100 Years' War bankrupted multiple English and French monarchs, despite both kingdoms being relatively wealthy. The need to conduct warfare for reasons of honour, of territorial defence, or of political necessity combined with inability to afford the costs, created impossible financial binds where kings had to pursue policies they couldn't afford. The court expenses maintaining the elaborate royal households that status required consumed substantial resources without providing political or military returns. The hundreds of courtiers, the expensive ceremonies, the gifts and rewards that maintained loyalty, the artistic patronage that demonstrated royal magnificence, and the overall display that kingship required all cost enormous amounts, while being essentially unproductive expenditures. Yet the king who economised on court expenses would be seen as weak or impoverished, damaging his political position. The need to maintain expensive court regardless of financial state created constant drain on resources. The debt servicing costs that accumulated when kings borrowed to cover shortfalls meant that increasing shares of royal revenues went to paying interest, rather than to funding current operations. The medieval interest rates were high, 20 to 40% annually wasn't unusual, meaning that borrowed money was extremely expensive. The king who borrowed to finance one war might find himself still paying for it years later, constraining his ability to address new challenges. The debt spiral, where borrowing to service existing debt created additional debt, was a common pattern in medieval royal finances. The limited borrowing options available to medieval kings meant that financing deficits was both expensive and difficult. The Jewish and Italian merchant bankers who provided royal loans charged high interest rates reflecting the real risk that kings might default or might use their power to avoid repayment. The loans often required pledging specific revenue sources as collateral, reducing kings' control over their own finances. The political complications when loans came from foreign bankers, whom local populations resented, added domestic political cost to financial arrangements. The difficulty and expense of borrowing meant that kings couldn't easily finance gaps between revenues and expenses. The default temptations where kings could theoretically refuse to repay loans or could seize lenders' assets created short-term financial relief but destroyed long-term creditworthiness. The Edward III default on Italian loans in the 1340s bankrupted major banking houses and made future borrowing difficult for English crown. The expulsion of Jewish lenders from various kingdoms eliminated reliable credit sources. The default or repudiation patterns meant that kings who most needed loans often had most difficulty obtaining them at any price. The taxation limits, where extraordinary taxation required consent from representative bodies, meant that kings couldn't simply raise taxes to meet financial needs, but had to negotiate and make political concessions in exchange for grants. The representative assemblies might grant less than kings requested, might attach conditions limiting how funds could be used, or might refuse grants entirely when politically opposed to royal policies. The political cost of taxation meant that even when additional revenues were theoretically available, the price of obtaining them might be too high. The inflation that occasionally occurred, particularly after major bullion discoveries or coinage debastements, could erode real value of fixed royal revenues. The king receiving customary dues set in nominal monetary terms might see real value decline as prices rose. The debasement of coinage to create seigniorage revenue could backfire when it caused inflation that reduced real purchasing power of royal income. The monetary complexities of medieval economics created situations where nominal revenues remained stable while real command over resources declined. The regional variation in royal wealth meant that some kingdoms were chronically impoverished, while others had better financial positions, but even wealthy kingdoms faced financial stresses. The English crown generally had better finances than many continental kingdoms due to relatively efficient taxation and wealthy economy. Yet even English kings faced constant financial struggles and died in debt despite being among better-off European monarchs. The relative financial position didn't eliminate stress, just determined whether financial crisis was constant or merely frequent. The personal responsibility where kings were personally liable for kingdom debts, and where their personal property could be seized by creditors, meant that royal financial problems became personal financial disasters. The distinction between royal and personal finances was fuzzy, with kings often using personal resources to cover official expenses and finding that official debts became personal obligations. The financial stress wasn't just abstract concern about national finances, but was immediate personal worry about debts and creditors. The comparison with wealthy nobles or successful merchants revealed that non-royal elites often lived more comfortably financially than monarchs, despite having less formal power. The great aristocrat with secure land revenues, minimal military obligations, and no requirement to maintain royal court lived within his means and accumulated wealth. The wealthy merchant who managed his business prudently retired prosperous and comfortable. The king was chronically indebted, constantly struggling to pay for necessary expenses, and often died leaving massive debts for his successor. The financial comparison made kingship look unattractive compared to positions that offered financial security without royal burdens. The inheritance of predecessors' debts meant that new kings often began reigns already buried under obligations they hadn't incurred. The son inheriting throne also inherited his father's unpaid loans, his outstanding obligations, and his financial messes. The new reign that should have been fresh start was instead hamstrung by inherited financial problems that limited the new king's options before he made any decisions of his own. The inherited debt created intergenerational financial trap, where royal financial problems persisted across reigns. The economic consequences of financial stress included inability to fund necessary military operations, inability to maintain adequate administrative apparatus, inability to conduct effective diplomacy, and general reduction in royal effectiveness resulting from lack of money. The king who couldn't afford to field adequate armies lost wars. The king who couldn't afford to pay officials saw administration deteriorate. The king who couldn't afford diplomatic expenses lost influence. The financial constraints translated directly into political and military weakness. Understanding royal finances reveals that medieval kingship involved constant financial stress, chronic indebtedness, and personal worry about money that made the economic dimension of kingship burden rather than privilege. The combination of structural deficits, expensive wars, necessary but unproductive court costs, limited revenues, difficult borrowing, and personal liability created financial situations that would be intolerable to anyone accustomed to financial security. The financial nightmares alone might make kingship undesirable to anyone valuing economic security over political power, demonstrating another dimension of why the throne was position that intelligent people might rationally avoid. The medieval king's life was thoroughly public performance, where privacy barely existed, where personal preferences were subordinated to political necessity, and where freedom to make personal choices was largely eliminated by the demands and expectations of kingship. Understanding these constraints on personal life reveals another dimension of why kingship was position that sacrificed personal happiness for public role. The constant observation where kings were literally never alone in any meaningful sense meant that privacy, as modern people understand it, simply didn't exist for monarchs. The chamberlains who attended the king on waking, the courtiers who accompanied him throughout the day, the guards who protected him constantly, and the servants who managed every aspect of his physical existence meant that the king was perpetually surrounded by people. The rare moments of relative solitude were still under surveillance. The security concerns and political pressures meant that kings couldn't simply be alone. The lack of privacy created a situation where kings' personal lives were thoroughly public. The performative nature of daily life, where every action was observed and judged, meant that kings couldn't relax or simply be themselves, but had to constantly maintain appropriate royal demeanour. The king who appeared weak, indecisive, or overly emotional would be judged as unfit for his position. The need to project confidence, authority, decisiveness, and control, even when actually confused, frightened or uncertain, created constant emotional labour. The performance wasn't occasional requirement, but was unending demand that shaped every waking moment. The eating in public, where royal meals were ceremonial events attended by courtiers rather than private family affairs, transformed basic biological necessity into political theatre. The elaborate service, the rigid protocols governing who could serve the king and how, and the audience observing the meal meant that even eating became public performance. The king couldn't simply eat food. He enjoyed at pace he preferred, but had to consume appropriate foods in appropriate manner while being watched. The transformation of eating into ceremony eliminated one of basic human pleasures and turned it into additional burden. The sleeping arrangements, where even bedchambers weren't fully private spaces and where people had access to king during night, meant that sleep itself became semi-public activity. The chamberlains who attended the king's bedtime, the guards stationed in or near bedchambers, and the protocols allowing certain officials to wake the king if necessary, meant that sleeping was less private than it is for ordinary people. The surveillance extending into nighttime created a situation where kings had essentially no privacy at any time. The marriage arrangements, determined by political necessity rather than personal preference, meant that kings couldn't choose their own spouses but had to marry for diplomatic, territorial, or political reasons. The king's wife was selected by others to serve kingdom's interests rather than husband's happiness. The personal compatibility or lack thereof was irrelevant to marriage that served political purposes. The inability to marry for love or even for personal compatibility eliminated one of major sources of personal happiness, and meant that king's most intimate relationship was determined by political calculation rather than personal choice. The sexual surveillance and regulation, where kings' sexual behaviour was monitored and judged based on political implications, meant that even intimate behaviour wasn't private or freely chosen. The illegitimate children that might create succession problems, the favouritism toward mistresses that might create political factions, and the scandals that might damage royal reputation meant that kings' sexual behaviour had political consequences that limited personal freedom. The inability to conduct private sexual life without political ramifications created additional constraint. The friendship limitations, where kings couldn't form genuine friendships based on personal affinity, but had to carefully navigate political implications of any close relationship, affected personal life profoundly. The friend who gained too much influence became politically dangerous. The intimate companion who didn't have appropriate rank created scandal. The personal confidant who couldn't be trusted absolutely created security risk. The inability to have genuine friendships without political complications created isolation that prevented the personal connections that humans need for psychological well-being. The leisure activities that were available to kings had to be appropriate to royal dignity and had to serve political purposes rather than simply providing enjoyment. The hunting that was acceptable, royal recreation, was actually elaborate ceremonial activity as much as sport. The tournaments that kings might participate in were political and military demonstrations rather than simple entertainment. The artistic patronage that kings might pursue was political statement about royal magnificence rather than personal aesthetic enjoyment. The leisure activities available had to serve political purposes, even when supposedly recreational. The geographical mobility restrictions meant that kings couldn't simply travel where they wished when they wished, but had to consider political implications of their locations and movements. The king had to be present at politically important locations, had to avoid places where he might be vulnerable, and had to maintain itineraries that served political purposes. The inability to visit places simply out of curiosity, or to take vacation from political responsibilities, meant that even travel was determined by duty rather than by personal preference. The time allocation determined by political and ceremonial obligations meant that kings' schedules were thoroughly controlled by others' expectations rather than by personal preference. The audiences that had to be granted, the ceremonies that had to be attended, the councils that had to be conducted, and the various other obligations consumed time according to political necessity rather than personal inclination. The king, who wanted to spend time on personal interests, found that his schedule was determined by others' demands rather than by his own preferences. The intellectual freedom limitations, where kings had to avoid public statements or positions that would create political problems, meant that even thoughts and ideas were constrained by political consequences. The king who developed religious doubts couldn't express them without political crisis. The king who had innovative ideas about governance had to suppress them if they would alienate supporters. The intellectual constraint that prevented free thinking and expression created mental straitjacket that made kingship intellectually stifling. The emotional expression constraints where kings had to maintain appropriate demeanour, regardless of personal feelings, meant that genuine emotional life had to be suppressed in favour of political requirements. The king who was grieving personal loss still had to present appropriate public face. The king who was privately terrified had to project confidence. The emotional suppression required to maintain appropriate royal presentation created psychological strain and prevented healthy emotional processing. The personal property limitations where theoretically everything belonged to king, but practically the king couldn't use resources for purely personal purposes without political consequences, meant that control over property was illusory. The king who spent treasury on personal pleasures rather than political necessities would face criticism and potential rebellion. The personal use of resources always had to be justified by political or diplomatic purposes rather than being simply for personal enjoyment. Understanding the lack of privacy and personal freedom reveals that medieval kingship eliminated personal autonomy and genuine private life in favour of unending public performance and political necessity. The position required sacrificing personal preferences, personal relationships, personal pleasures, and personal freedom in service of role that was thoroughly public and thoroughly political. The lack of any genuine private life or personal autonomy made kingship psychologically stifling position that prevented the personal satisfactions and personal connections that create human happiness. The constraint on personal life alone might make kingship undesirable to anyone valuing personal autonomy and private life over public power. The religious dimension of medieval kingship created psychological burden where conscientious monarchs feared divine judgment for their actions, while knowing that political necessity often required violating Christian principles. Understanding the religious terrors that tormented medieval kings reveals another dimension of psychological stress that made the position genuinely burdensome. The divine right ideology that legitimized royal authority by claiming kings, ruled by God's will, created theological accountability where kings answered to God for their exercise of power. The belief that kingship was divinely ordained meant that kings would face divine judgment for how they fulfilled their divinely appointed role. The religious framework that legitimized royal power also created fearful responsibility, where kings would answer to God for every decision, every act of violence, every exercise of authority. The conscientious king who took religion seriously faced terrifying prospect of eternal damnation as punishment for political mistakes or necessary evils. The fundamental contradiction between Christian ethics emphasizing mercy, peace, forgiveness, and humility, and political realities requiring violence, war, punishment, and authority created impossible bind for Christian kings trying to rule effectively while remaining Christian. The king knew that turning the other cheek would lead to political destruction, that blessing those who cursed him would be interpreted as weakness, that forgiving enemies would encourage challenges to his authority. Yet the Christian principles he was taught demanded exactly these behaviours. The gap between Christian ideals and political necessities created constant moral tension. The violence dilemma where kings were responsible for ordering executions, for conducting wars, for crushing rebellions, and for various other acts of violence that Christian doctrine condemned as sinful created guilt that tormented conscientious monarchs. The king ordering execution knew he was taking life in violation of commandment against killing. The king conducting war knew he was responsible for deaths of thousands. In pursuit of worldly political goals, the violence that political position required conflicted directly with Christian teaching about sanctity of life and prohibition on killing. The torture and harsh punishment that medieval justice employed, and that kings were responsible for authorizing violated Christian teachings about mercy and compassion. The use of torture to extract confessions, the brutal public executions designed to intimidate subjects, and the harsh corporal punishments that medieval law prescribed all conflicted with Christian ideals of mercy and forgiveness. Yet the king who showed excessive mercy would be seen as weak and would encourage crime and rebellion. The justice system required harshness that Christian conscience condemned. The taxation of poor subjects to fund wars and court expenses created moral problem where kings were enriching themselves and funding violence through extracting resources from people who could barely afford necessities. The Christian teaching about helping the poor and about avoiding exploitation of the weak conflicted directly with fiscal policies that taxed peasants to fund aristocratic warfare. The conscientious king who extracted taxes from poor subjects to fund wars violated Christian teaching about treatment of the poor. The church-state conflicts where political interests of crown conflicted with claims of church created situations where kings had to choose between political necessity and religious obedience. The king who defied pope or bishops risked excommunication and perhaps damnation for disobedience to religious authority. Yet the king who submitted completely to church authority might sacrifice political interests and might fail in his duty to kingdom. The conflicts between political duty and religious obedience created impossible choices, where either option seemed wrong. The deathbed confessions that many kings made, attempting to gain absolution for a lifetime of politically necessary sins, reveal the religious terror that accumulated during royal careers. The common pattern of kings on their deathbeds confessing sins, begging forgiveness, making restitution where possible, and expressing fear of judgment demonstrates that many kings lived with real religious terror about divine punishment. The deathbed scenes of powerful monarchs begging forgiveness and expressing fear reveal that power didn't eliminate fundamental religious anxiety. The purgatory fears that medieval Christianity emphasized created terror about suffering after death, even if ultimate salvation was achieved. The belief that sins had to be purged through suffering before entering heaven meant that even kings who hoped for eventual salvation faced prospect of centuries or millennia of torment in purgatory. The purgatorial suffering, imagined as more intense than any earthly suffering, created fearful anticipation that haunted conscientious believers. The eternal damnation possibility, where particularly serious sins might result in endless torment in hell, created ultimate terror for medieval Christians. The king, who had ordered many deaths, who had conducted unjust wars, who had exploited subjects, or who had committed other grave sins, faced genuine possibility of eternal damnation. The medieval descriptions of hell's torments were vivid and terrifying, creating images that haunted imagination and created real psychological terror for believers who took doctrine seriously. The masses and prayers that kings endowed and that they directed others to perform after their deaths reveal attempts to secure divine mercy and to reduce purgatorial suffering. The elaborate provisions for prayers, for masses, for alms, and for various other religious activities all aimed at gaining divine mercy after death. The investment in these spiritual preparations reveals that kings took afterlife seriously and sought to mitigate divine judgment through religious devotion and charitable works. The personal devotion that many kings practiced, regular prayer, religious observances, support for religious institutions, partly reflected genuine piety, but also reflected fear of judgment. The king spending hours in prayer wasn't necessarily just performing religious duty, but was also seeking divine mercy and forgiveness. The religious devotion was both expression of faith and attempt to gain security about salvation through demonstrating piety. The religious advisors that conscientious kings employed to provide spiritual counsel and to help navigate moral dilemmas reveals need for assistance in reconciling political necessities with religious demands. The confessor who heard kings' sins and provided spiritual guidance, the theologian who helped interpret religious requirements, and the various religious advisors who helped kings maintain Christian conscience while exercising power all demonstrate that conscientious kings struggled with religious dimension of their role. The comparison with religious vocations like monasticism that was seen as reliably leading to salvation made kingship seem spiritually dangerous in comparison. The monk who lived according to religious rule had relatively clear path to salvation. The king who was mired in worldly concerns, who exercised violence, who was responsible for many deaths, and who lived in luxury faced far more uncertain salvation prospects. The spiritual comparison made kingship seem dangerous from religious perspective, even while appearing prestigious from worldly perspective. Understanding religious dimensions reveals that conscientious medieval kings lived with psychological burden of fearing divine judgment for actions that political role required. The conflict between Christian ethics and political necessities, the guilt about violence and exploitation, the terror about divine punishment, and the uncertainty about salvation all created psychological weight that made kingship spiritually burdensome and psychologically distressing. The religious terrors added to other stresses and created additional reason why thoughtful people might find kingship undesirable, despite its worldly power and prestige. The family relationships of medieval kings were poisoned by succession politics, by competing ambitions, and by the reality that relatives were often most dangerous enemies. Understanding how kingship destroyed family bonds reveals another dimension of personal cost that made the position genuinely undesirable, despite its apparent benefits. The father-son relationships that should have been supportive and loving were poisoned by succession expectations, where sons waited impatiently for fathers to die so they could inherit power. The aging king watching his sons and wondering which might try to hasten his death created paranoid suspicion that destroyed family bonds. The son watching his father retain power while he waited decades for inheritance developed resentment that prevented genuine filial affection. The succession pressures transformed natural father-son relationship into political rivalry, where each saw the other as obstacle to their desires. The brother relationships that might have provided companionship and support instead became deadly rivalries, where brothers competed for inheritance, or where younger brothers threatened elder brothers' positions. The numerous cases of fratricidal violence in medieval royal families, brothers killing brothers, brothers leading rebellions against brothers, brothers plotting assassinations, demonstrate that fraternal bonds were casualties of succession politics. The king couldn't trust his brothers because their interests inherently conflicted with his own, making siblings into enemies rather than allies. The mother-son relationships, complicated by Queen Mother's interests in maintaining power and influence, created conflicts where mothers and sons had competing agendas. The Queen Mother who tried to maintain influence during son's reign might be seen as interfering rather than helpful. The king who tried to assert independence from mother's influence might be seen as ungrateful. The mother-son conflicts that erupted in multiple medieval courts demonstrate that even maternal relationship was distorted by political pressures. The marital relationships distorted by political marriages, by succession pressures regarding heirs, and by infidelity meant that kings rarely enjoyed genuine companionate marriages. The wife selected for political reasons might not be personally compatible. The pressure to produce male heirs transformed sexual relationship into duty rather than pleasure. The king's extramarital affairs that were politically tolerated or even expected created marital conflict. The queen's potential infidelity that might create succession uncertainties made marital trust impossible. The political dimensions of royal marriage prevented the genuine partnership that creates marital happiness. The legitimate versus illegitimate children created family divisions where half-siblings competed, and where different children received vastly different treatment based on birth circumstances. The illegitimate son, who might be personally favoured but who couldn't inherit, created resentment. The legitimate son, who received inheritance based on birth rather than merit, created succession problems if he was incompetent. The differential treatment of children based on legitimacy rather than on personal qualities created family conflicts that destroyed sibling bonds. The succession disputes that erupted when king died without clear heir, or when succession was contested, created extended family conflicts, affecting cousins, uncles, nephews, and various other relatives. The Wars of Roses in England pitted cousins against cousins in decades of conflict that killed many royal relatives. The succession disputes across medieval Europe regularly pitted family members against each other in conflicts that destroyed extended family bonds. The succession politics made all relatives into potential enemies. The regency conflicts when kings died, leaving underage heirs, created competitions where relatives vied for control of government during minority reigns. The uncles, mothers, grandfathers, and various other relatives who sought regency power fought each other instead of cooperating to protect minor kings' interests. The regency competitions demonstrated that family members couldn't cooperate, even when supposedly serving shared interest in protecting child king. The inheritance law complexities and disputes over territories, titles, and wealth meant that even after succession was determined, family conflicts continued over the details of inheritance, the conflicts over which territories passed to which relatives, over whether younger sons received adequate provision, and over various other inheritance details created ongoing family conflicts that persisted across generations. The inheritance disputes transformed family members into litigants rather than into mutually supportive relatives. The marriages of children used as diplomatic tools meant that royal children were sent to foreign courts as teenagers, or even as children, destroying parent-child bonds for political purposes. The daughter married to foreign monarch at age 12 never developed genuine relationship with father, who traded her for alliance. The son sent to foreign court as hostage couldn't maintain family bonds with parents he rarely saw. The political use of children's marriages destroyed family relationships in service of diplomatic necessity. The child mortality rates that were high, even among royalty, meant that parents lost multiple children, and siblings lost brothers and sisters regularly. The emotional impact of child mortality was potentially mitigated by frequency and by expectation, but the losing multiple children still created grief that affected parents profoundly. The surviving children who had watched siblings die learned that family bonds were temporary and fragile. The assassination fears within families where kings couldn't fully trust close relatives who might seek power created paranoid atmosphere that poisoned all family interactions. The king who suspected his son of impatience for succession couldn't interact naturally with his heir. The king who worried about brothers plotting rebellion couldn't enjoy fraternal companionship. The pervasive suspicion that political survival required destroyed possibility of genuine family affection. The historical examples of family betrayals and violence provided constant reminders that family bonds couldn't be trusted. The William Rufus possibly killed by brother or nephew, the Edward VII deposed and murdered with wife's involvement, the Richard III accused of murdering nephews, and countless other examples of family violence, reminded medieval royalty that relatives were dangerous. The historical precedents made paranoid suspicion rational rather than pathological. The comparison with non-royal families where inheritance was significant but not crown-worthy showed that royal families were distinctly dysfunctional. The merchant family dividing business among children might have disputes but rarely descended into murderous violence. The noble family dealing with inheritance usually managed to avoid fratricidal war. The crown's exceptional value made royal family dynamics exceptionally destructive, demonstrating that kingship poisoned family bonds in ways that other forms of wealth and power didn't necessarily do. Understanding family dimensions reveals that kingship destroyed the family bonds and personal relationships that provide humans with essential emotional support and personal satisfaction. The position required viewing family members as political rivals, required sacrificing children for diplomatic purposes, required living with paranoid suspicion of closest relatives, and generally prevented the genuine family relationships that create personal happiness. The destruction of family bonds created isolation and emotional deprivation that made kingship psychologically lonely, despite being physically surrounded by people. The family costs alone might make kingship undesirable to anyone valuing genuine human connection over political power. The military dimension of medieval kingship required personal battlefield leadership that exposed kings to combat dangers while also creating military obligations that consumed resources and created constant stress. Understanding military aspects reveals another dimension of danger and burden that made kingship undesirable position. The personal combat leadership expectations that medieval culture imposed meant that kings were expected to personally lead armies and to demonstrate physical courage in battle. The king who avoided battlefield personally would be seen as coward unworthy of his position. The military leadership requirement wasn't merely strategic direction from safe distance, but was expected to involve personal presence in combat where king shared his soldiers' dangers. The battlefield requirement exposed kings to all combat hazards, including the specific additional danger that enemies particularly targeted monarchs. The tournament participation that was expected of medieval kings provided peacetime opportunity to demonstrate martial prowess, but also created injury and death risks. The tournaments where knights fought with weapons that could kill or maim weren't safe sporting events, but were genuinely dangerous activities. The kings who participated faced risks of serious injury or death in activities that served primarily to demonstrate prowess rather than achieve necessary objectives. The deaths of Henry II of France from tournament injury and various other royal tournament casualties demonstrated that even peacetime military activities were deadly serious. The siege warfare that characterized much medieval military activity exposed kings to extended periods of danger discomfort, and disease risk. The king leading siege of enemy castle might spend months in crude field conditions, exposed to enemy missile fire, risking disease from poor sanitation, and enduring physical discomfort that was far worse than normal court life. The siege requirements transformed king from living in palace to living in tent, eating campaign rations, and enduring conditions that were degrading compared to normal royal life. The strategic responsibilities where kings were expected to make military decisions that would determine success or failure created enormous pressure, with potentially deadly consequences. The king, whose strategic decisions led to military defeat, faced not just professional failure, but potential deposition, death, or at minimum permanent damage to his reputation and authority. The military decision-making required expertise that kings might not possess, created pressure that was psychologically crushing, and led to consequences that could be catastrophic. The ransom requirements when kings were captured in battle created situations where monarchs' personal freedom and kingdoms' resources were held hostage. The Richard thus captured, returning from crusade and held for enormous ransom, the John II of France captured at Poitiers and held for ransom that nearly bankrupted France. And various other cases of captured kings demonstrated that battlefield defeat could lead to humiliating captivity and ruinous financial demands. The capture risk added to other battlefield dangers. The health consequences of campaigns including diseases, injuries, exhaustion and exposure affected kings who participated personally in military operations. The dysentery, typhus, and various other diseases that ravaged medieval armies didn't exempt kings from infection. The physical exhaustion of campaigns affected kings as much as soldiers. The cold, wet, inadequate food, and poor sanitation of campaign conditions impacted royal health regardless of rank. The health consequences of campaigning shortened lifespans and created chronic health problems. The financial burden of warfare, already discussed in financial section, had personal dimension, where kings felt responsible for costs and worried about ability to fund necessary operations. The king who couldn't afford adequate forces faced personal stress about military inadequacy. The king who borrowed heavily to fund campaigns worried about debts and about consequences of default. The financial stress of military obligations created chronic anxiety that affected quality of life. The time demands of military campaigns took kings away from families, from comfortable palaces, and from other activities for months or years at a time. The king conducting extended campaigns spent long periods in uncomfortable circumstances, in constant danger, and without the personal amenities that normal life provided. The time cost of military service reduced the time available for any activity not related to warfare. The political consequences of military failure, where defeats led to rebellions, to deposition attempts, or to loss of territories, created stakes that made military obligations extraordinarily stressful. The king wasn't merely engaging in military operations for abstract purposes, but was risking his position and his life on military outcomes. The political stakes of warfare meant that military obligations carried enormous pressure beyond the simple battlefield dangers. The moral burden of responsibility for deaths of soldiers, for destruction of enemy populations, and for all violence that warfare entailed created psychological weight for conscientious kings. The king who ordered army into battle knew he was responsible for deaths of his own soldiers and of enemies. The moral weight of these deaths affected conscientious monarchs, even when warfare was politically necessary. The perpetual nature of military obligations, where wars were frequent and where military preparedness required constant attention, meant that military dimension of kingship was never-ending burden, rather than occasional requirement. The king who finished one war soon faced demands to prepare for next conflict. The military obligations consumed attention and resources continuously, rather than being occasional interruption of peacetime activities. The comparison with non-royal military leaders showed that kings' military obligations were more burdensome than those of subordinate commanders. The noble leading his own forces could pick his battles more carefully, and could withdraw from unsuccessful campaigns more easily than the king, whose personal presence was politically necessary. The professional soldier could retire from military service when age or inclination dictated. The king had no such flexibility and faced military obligations that continued regardless of personal capacity or inclination. Understanding military dimensions reveals that kingship involved constant military obligations that exposed kings to combat dangers, required enduring uncomfortable campaign conditions, created enormous stress about strategic decisions with potentially catastrophic consequences, and generally made military dimension of role both dangerous and burdensome. The military requirements alone created sufficient stress and danger that military-averse individuals might rationally view kingship as undesirable despite its power. The combination of personal combat danger and strategic responsibility made military dimension one of the most genuinely dangerous and stressful aspects of medieval kingship. The documented historical cases where individuals refused crowns, or where kings abdicated their thrones, provide direct evidence that medieval people sometimes recognised that kingship was an undesirable position worth avoiding. Understanding these cases reveals that crown refusal wasn't merely theoretical possibility, but was actual practice that occurred when individuals calculated that costs of kingship exceeded benefits. The Richard of Cornwall's initial reluctance before accepting election as King of the Romans in 1257 reflected his awareness of the financial and political costs of the position. Richard negotiated carefully about financial support and about political circumstances before accepting, because he understood that the crown would bring burdens as well as prestige. His eventual acceptance was calculated decision, based on specific terms rather than eager grasping at opportunity, demonstrating that informed medieval actors approached crowns with caution rather than unthinking desire. The Stephen Langton's pressure on King John leading to Magna Carta reflected ecclesiastical understanding that kingship needed constraint, and that kings themselves might benefit from limitations on their power. The baronial and ecclesiastical forces that sought to limit royal power weren't merely seeking to weaken kings, but were also arguably seeking to make kingship sustainable and survivable by reducing the impossible burdens that unlimited monarchy imposed. The constitutional developments limiting royal power partly reflected understanding that unconstrained kingship was unsustainable. The Edward VIII's abdication in 1936 occurred long after medieval period, but reflected similar calculations about whether crown was worth personal cost. His choice of personal happiness over royal duty demonstrated that even in modern period with reduced dangers, the constraints of kingship could seem unacceptable to individuals valuing personal life over public role. The parallel with medieval cases suggests that calculation of costs versus benefits of kingship is timeless consideration rather than merely medieval peculiarity. The reluctant monarchs who accepted crowns out of duty rather than desire demonstrate that many medieval rulers understood kingship as burden rather than prize. The sources that describe kings accepting crowns reluctantly, that record their expressions of anxiety about responsibilities, and that show their awareness of dangers, all demonstrate that informed medieval people knew that kingship was a difficult and dangerous position. The acceptance out of duty rather than desire characterized many who became kings despite understanding the costs. The child kings whose regents fought over control demonstrated that even crown itself wasn't universally desired, as regents sought power without accepting full royal responsibility. The regents who governed during minorities sought power and benefits without accepting dangers and responsibilities of actually being king. The pattern where regents competed for power during minorities, but where same individuals sometimes avoided accepting crown, themselves demonstrates distinction between desiring power and desiring kingship itself. The clerical refusals of crowns or of regent positions in several cases reflected ecclesiastical understanding that worldly power was spiritually dangerous. The bishops who refused regent positions or who declined to press claims to thrones demonstrated that religious perspective often viewed kingship as spiritually perilous despite worldly benefits. The clerical reluctance reflected understanding that power corrupted, and that kingship particularly was dangerous to soul. The succession disputes where potential claimants deliberately didn't press claims they might have pursued demonstrate selective avoidance of crown when circumstances made it particularly dangerous. The noble who had plausible claim but who chose not to press it in circumstances where doing so would likely lead to death was making rational calculation that life was preferable to slim chance at crown. The selective claim pressing where individuals pursued crowns when circumstances were favourable, but avoided claims when circumstances were dangerous, demonstrates strategic calculation rather than blind desire for kingship. The provisions in wills where kings expressed relief at approaching end and delegated responsibilities to successors reflect psychological burden lifting as death approached. The deathbed statements expressing satisfaction that burdens were ending that responsibilities were passing to heirs, and that struggles were concluding all suggest that kings experienced their positions as burdens that death relieved, rather than as privileges that death cruelly ended. The comparative ambitions where individuals sought powerful positions other than kingship demonstrate that ambitious people often pursued power through means other than seeking crowns. The nobles who built vast territorial holdings, the bishops who achieved ecclesiastical authority, the merchants who accumulated wealth, and various others who achieved success and power through non-royal means, all demonstrate that ambitious people had alternative paths that might have been deliberately chosen over pursuing crowns. Understanding cases of crown refusal and abdication reveals that medieval people sometimes explicitly recognised that kingship was undesirable, and acted on that understanding by refusing crowns or by abandoning thrones when possible. The pattern of reluctant acceptance, strategic avoidance, and relief at ending demonstrates that informed medieval actors often viewed kingship as burden rather than prize, and made rational calculations that sometimes led to avoiding or abandoning crowns when circumstances permitted such choices. The elaborate propaganda systems that medieval kingdoms employed to maintain the fiction that kingship was glorious and desirable position reveal that the reality required constant ideological work to overcome. Understanding the propaganda dimensions reveals that medieval people knew kingship was difficult, and that maintaining the system required convincing people that crowns were worth pursuing despite obvious costs. The coronation ceremonies with their elaborate rituals, religious sanction, and spectacular displays served to create awe, and to establish that kingship was divinely ordained position worthy of respect and sacrifice. The coronation wasn't simple crown placing, but was extended ceremony involving religious rites, oaths, anointing with holy oil, and various elements designed to establish both sacred and political legitimacy. The coronation ceremony's elaborateness served propaganda purpose of making kingship seem so important and so sacred that accepting its burdens was necessary duty. The royal iconography in art, architecture, and heraldry constantly reinforced images of royal power, legitimacy, and glory. The portraits showing kings in magnificent robes surrounded by symbols of authority, the architecture creating physical expressions of royal power, and the heraldic devices marking royal property all created visual culture that celebrated kingship and that made royal position seem glorious. The constant visual propaganda worked to maintain perception that kingship was pinnacle of achievement worth aspiring to. The court culture, creating elaborate etiquette, ceremony, and display, served to distinguish kings from ordinary people, and to create sense that royal position was fundamentally different kind of existence. The ceremony surrounding kings, the elaborate protocols governing interactions with monarchs, and the constant display of magnificence all worked to create psychological distance that made kingship seem special rather than simply difficult. The court culture's elaborateness served propaganda purpose of justifying kingship's costs through emphasizing its unique prestige. The literary celebrations of kings in chronicles, poetry, and various forms of writing created narratives that emphasized royal glory while downplaying costs and difficulties. The chronicles that praised kings' achievements, the poetry that celebrated royal valor, and the various literary productions that portrayed kingship positively all contributed to ideological work of maintaining fiction that crowns were desirable. The literary propaganda often bore little relationship to the lived experience of actual monarchs, but served to maintain cultural belief in kingship's value. The religious justification claiming divine right and sacred authority provided theological foundation for kingship that made refusing crowns seem like refusing divine will. The ideology that kings ruled by God's appointment meant that accepting crown was accepting divine calling, rather than merely pursuing worldly ambition. The religious dimension of royal propaganda made crown refusal seem not just unambitious, but impious, creating moral pressure to accept kingship even when practical consideration suggested avoidance. The law and legal theory that emphasized royal authority, and that cast kingship as essential for social order, served propaganda purpose of justifying monarchy by making it seem necessary for civilization itself. The legal and political theories that claimed royal authority was essential for preventing chaos and for maintaining justice created ideological framework where kingship was service to society rather than merely personal position. the theoretical justification worked to cast accepting crown as duty to society, rather than merely pursuing self-interest. The rewards and honour system, where kings dispensed titles, lands and various benefits, created incentive structure that made serving crown attractive, even if crown itself wasn't necessarily desirable. The propaganda worked on multiple levels, making crowns seem desirable, while also making service to crown attractive through material rewards. The incentive structure maintained system, even when kingship itself might be recognised as burdensome by making participation in royal system beneficial. The comparative denigration of alternative paths where non-royal positions were portrayed as inferior served to maintain hierarchy that placed kingship at apex. The cultural messages that kingship was supreme achievement, that anything less was failure of ambition, and that pursuing crown was natural goal of ambitious people, all worked to maintain ideological support for monarchical system. The propaganda establishing kingship as supreme goal prevented widespread questioning of whether crown was actually desirable. The historical narrative selection where successful kings were celebrated, while unsuccessful or unhappy kings were downplayed or explained away, served to maintain positive image of kingship overall. The collective memory that emphasized glorious reigns while forgetting or excusing problematic ones created historical narrative that made kingship seem generally successful, despite many individual failures. The selective memory served propaganda purpose of maintaining belief in kingship's value. The educational systems where royal children were taught that kingship was their destiny, and that accepting crown was their duty, served to prepare heirs psychologically for accepting positions they might otherwise want to refuse. The royal education that emphasized duty, that praised royal ancestors, and that prepared heirs to accept kingship worked to overcome natural reluctance, and to channel royal children toward accepting their roles, despite understanding the costs. The silencing or marginalization of critics who questioned whether kingship was desirable, or who explicitly stated preference for other positions, served to maintain ideological consensus. The cultural mechanisms that dismissed crown refusals as cowardice, that criticised abdications as dereliction of duty, and that generally made questioning kingship's value difficult, all served to prevent widespread recognition that crowns might rationally be avoided. Understanding propaganda dimensions reveals that maintaining medieval monarchy required constant ideological work to overcome recognition that kingship was difficult, dangerous, and often unpleasant position. The elaborate systems of ceremony, art, literature, religious justification, legal theory, incentive structure, and selective history all served to maintain fiction that crowns were prizes worth suffering for. The propaganda's necessity demonstrates that without constant ideological reinforcement, the obvious costs of kingship might lead to widespread crown avoidance that would make monarchical system unsustainable. The propaganda served essential function of preventing collective recognition that many of the costs of medieval kingship might rationally outweigh benefits, maintaining system that served broader social purposes even when individual monarchs suffered. As this comprehensive exploration of medieval kingship's genuine undesirability concludes, what emerges most powerfully is recognition that the throne, far from being ultimate achievement that romantic imagination suggests, was actually position combining maximum responsibility with maximum danger, maximum constraint with maximum vulnerability, and maximum public prestige with maximum personal misery. The surprising reality that intelligent medieval people had genuinely good reasons to avoid kingship when possible challenges, fundamental assumptions about power, prestige, and desirability, while revealing that positions appearing most attractive from outside often impose costs invisible to external observers, but painfully obvious to those actually occupying them. The mortality statistics revealing that medieval kings died violently at rates approaching 40% demonstrate conclusively that wearing crown was genuinely life-threatening occupation. The assassination, battlefield death, murder by relatives, and execution after deposition that claimed so many monarchs created mortality patterns that would be completely unacceptable in any modern context. The kings who survived to die of natural causes were lucky minorities rather than normal outcomes. The rational person evaluating these statistics would reasonably conclude that the crown significantly decreased life expectancy, and that pursuing kingship meant accepting substantial probability of violent death. The mortality dimension alone provides sufficient evidence that medieval kingship was genuinely dangerous in ways that made it rationally avoidable rather than universally desirable. The impossible political pressures that kings faced from multiple competing power centres, possessing limited actual capacity to enforce their will despite theoretical authority, and living under constant threat of rebellion created situations of extraordinary stress and vulnerability. The king couldn't simply command obedience, but had to maintain precarious balance between noble, ecclesiastical, urban, and various other power centres that possessed genuine capability to resist or overthrow royal authority. The political position was fundamentally vulnerable rather than secure, creating constant stress about maintaining authority and preventing coalitions that could lead to deposition or death. The political dimension made kingship exhausting psychological burden rather than comfortable exercise of dominance. The financial nightmares where kings lived in chronic debt despite theoretical control of kingdoms' resources, struggled constantly with inadequate funds to meet necessary expenses, and faced personal liability for debts they often couldn't repay created economic stress that made kingship financially burdensome despite apparent wealth. The structural deficits, expensive wars, necessary court costs, limited revenues, difficult borrowing, and personal responsibility combined to create financial situations that would be intolerable to anyone accustomed to economic security. The kings often lived less comfortably financially than wealthy merchants or nobles, despite having more power and prestige. The economic dimension made kingship financially stressful rather than financially comfortable. The complete lack of privacy and personal freedom where kings lived entirely public lives, with every action observed and judged, where personal preferences were subordinated to political necessity, and where genuine personal relationships were impossible due to political implications, created existence that was psychologically stifling and personally unsatisfying. The inability to ever be truly alone, to form genuine friendships, to choose spouse for love, to pursue personal interests or to make personal decisions without political consequences, eliminated the personal autonomy and personal connections that create human happiness. The constraint on personal life made kingship psychologically imprisoning despite apparent freedom that power should provide. The religious terrors where conscientious kings feared divine judgment for actions that political necessity required created psychological burden that tormented believers who took Christianity seriously. The fundamental conflicts between Christian ethics and political realities, the guilt about violence and exploitation, the fear of purgatory or damnation, and the uncertainty about salvation all created spiritual anxiety that made kingship religiously dangerous from medieval Christian perspective. The religious dimension added psychological torment to other stresses and created concerns about eternal consequences that extended beyond merely earthly suffering. The family betrayals and succession crises that poisoned relationships with relatives who should have been personal support networks instead became deadly rivals, created isolation and emotional deprivation. The inability to trust father, sons, brothers, or other relatives due to succession politics destroyed family bonds that provide essential emotional support. The families that should have been sources of comfort instead became sources of danger and stress. The family dimension created emotional isolation that made kingship personally lonely, despite being physically surrounded by people. The military obligations requiring personal battlefield leadership that exposed kings to combat dangers while creating enormous stress about strategic decisions with potentially catastrophic consequences made military dimension genuinely dangerous and burdensome. The expectation of personal combat participation, the months of uncomfortable campaign conditions, the pressure of strategic decision-making, and the political consequences of military failure combined to make military obligations one of the most stressful and dangerous aspects of kingship. The military dimension created both physical danger and psychological pressure that made kingship genuinely hazardous. The cases of crown refusals and abdications providing direct evidence that medieval people sometimes concluded kingship was worth avoiding demonstrate that recognition of kingship's undesirability wasn't merely modern analysis, but was understanding that some medieval actors achieved and acted upon. The reluctant acceptances, strategic avoidances, and relief at endings all demonstrate that informed medieval people often viewed kingship as burden rather than prize. The historical cases validate the analysis that kingship was genuinely undesirable to rational observers. The massive propaganda efforts required to maintain fiction that kingship was glorious and desirable reveal that maintaining monarchical system required constant ideological work to overcome recognition of kingship's costs. The ceremonies, iconography, literature, religious justification, legal theory, and various other propaganda mechanisms worked to create and maintain belief that crowns were worth pursuing despite obvious costs. The propaganda's necessity demonstrates that without constant ideological reinforcement, collective recognition of kingship's burdens might lead to crown avoidance that would make system unsustainable. The comparative analysis with other elite positions reveals that kingship often imposed greater costs and provided less personal satisfaction than positions with less formal prestige but better actual living conditions. The wealthy bishop living comfortably in episcopal palace with secure income and without life-threatening political pressures, the successful merchant accumulating wealth and retiring comfortably without assassination fears, the great noble enjoying hereditary lands and status without bearing full royal responsibilities. All these positions often provided better lives than kingship despite having less formal prestige. The comparison demonstrates that apparent prestige often inversely correlates with actual life quality. The broader implications about power and happiness suggest that maximum power often creates minimum personal satisfaction, that apparent prestige often conceals genuine misery, and that positions appearing most attractive from outside often impose costs invisible to observers, but obvious to occupants. The medieval kingship reveals in extreme form the general principle that apparent desirability often differs from actual experience, and that rational evaluation considering all dimensions might lead to very different conclusions about desirability than naive external observation suggests. The lessons for contemporary context include recognition that positions of maximum apparent power often impose maximum stress and constraints, that prestige and happiness don't necessarily correlate, that rational career choices should consider full costs, not just apparent benefits, and that avoiding apparently prestigious positions might sometimes be wisest choice. The medieval example provides vivid illustration of principles that remain relevant in modern contexts where prestigious positions often impose hidden costs on occupants. As light returns and this exploration of medieval kingship's genuine undesirability concludes, what remains is profound recognition that the crown that seemed so glorious in romantic imagination was actually burden that combined extraordinary danger with extraordinary stress, that eliminated privacy and personal freedom, that destroyed family bonds, that created financial anxiety despite apparent wealth, that imposed impossible political pressures, and that generally made life shorter, more stressful, and less personally satisfying than alternatives available to medieval elites. The surprising reality that intelligent medieval people had good reasons to avoid kingship, when possible challenges romantic narratives, while revealing that power and happiness often diverge rather than coinciding. The recognition that many who wore crowns did so from duty, or from lack of alternatives rather than from genuine desire, demonstrates that apparent ambition to rule often concealed resignation to unavoidable fate, rather than revealing eager pursuit of desired position. The medieval kings, who lived lives of constant danger, impossible pressure, complete public exposure, religious terror, family betrayal, military obligation, and personal constraint, were paying enormous prices for their apparent power and prestige. The throne that seemed so desirable from distance revealed itself to be prison and death sentence to many who actually occupied it. The position that should have represented ultimate achievement instead represented burden that intelligent observers rightly feared and rationally avoided when circumstances permitted such avoidance. The surprising truth that nobody genuinely wanted to be king in medieval times, or more precisely, that those who understood what kingship actually entailed had compelling reasons to avoid it, challenges assumptions about power, while revealing that apparent desirability often conceals genuine misery. The crown was more curse than blessing, more burden than prize, more imprisonment than freedom. The recognition that medieval monarchy required constant propaganda to maintain belief in kingship's desirability demonstrates that without ideological work, overcoming rational recognition of costs, collective understanding that crowns were worth avoiding might have emerged, potentially transforming medieval political systems in ways that actually would have better, served both individual happiness and collective well-being by distributing power more broadly, rather than concentrating it in a single enormously burdened position that destroyed the lives and happiness of those chosen or forced to occupy it.